It's live. Last time it started the recording YouTube and it never told YouTube the recording is done. So hopefully it'll do it right this time. Okay. I see it streaming, so we should be good. Okay, David, the class is all yours.
Okay. Hello, everybody. Welcome to week 3. Just as a reminder, don't ever be in any way hesitant about reaching out. If there's anything you want to follow up, we're still here to help. And, you know, we're more than happy to talk at any time and discuss anything that comes up in the sessions or that you're worried about from a career point of view. So today what I want to do is talk to you about the topic of regulation in particular, and then drill down a little bit into how that starts to play out on a city by city level. I think one of the key things to bear in mind, we've talked obviously about the wider ecosystem, we've talked then in week 2 about the technology, and it's time to take a step back for this week to a slightly more distant perspective and look at the actual framework, the regulatory environment that autonomy will develop in. Because quite apart from everything that we talk about on the commercial side and that we talk about from a technology point of view, a key factor in how this all unfolds will be how the interplay between all of the different stakeholders, and those stakeholders include government at various levels and then also the public. So what we'll do is go through all that today and look at the big questions and say, you know, how do we make sure that this technology is safe? Who makes sure that this technology is safe? And what do we even mean when we say safe? Is it that you can deploy autonomy? And in particular, this applies to self-driving cars rather than, you know, sidewalk robots or any of the other types of autonomy we talked about before. A lot of this is very specific to the car use case. But how do we decide if a self-driving car is as good as an average human driver? Is that good enough? Probably not, because we're aspiring to better than that. But how much better? So if self-driving cars are 10% better than an average human, are they then good enough that we're happy to let them roam the streets? It's hard to even figure out who's qualified to make these decisions. These aren't decisions that are an obvious skill set where there's very clear-cut data to work off. And you know, what's the balance here between, say, the commercial interests of the companies who are developing these technologies versus the public opinion? So if people want to give up their driving abilities, is that it's a question of something that we should force people towards, or is it something where we should let the public decide the pace? So there'll be a number of different players as we look at this. So anybody, any questions at this stage or want to make any observations before we move on? And it just as a matter of interest, so I've uploaded the slides. They're there on Driverless World School for everybody to download. If don't worry as we go through it. If some of the slides are a bit text heavy, that you have to read them before I move on. You've got your full copy of everything, as well as links to download for anyone who goes away from today inspired about all of the exciting documentation and regulations that you can read. I've given you links to them in the slides. So I think what is important then to do, just to set some context, is to say that from a departmental point of view, the Department of Transport in the US, going back a couple of years ago, Anthony Fox was the man in charge. And he outlined, he could see this coming and say, this is the biggest thing that the Department of Transportation has ever had to deal with. This is something that's brand new and it has to be done right because safety is at stake. So it really is a giant challenge. And at the moment, it's the Department of Transportation in the US that are dealing with things. But we'll pull in what I want to do throughout the next kind of 3/4 of an hour as we discuss this, is pull in some global examples and talk about what's going on elsewhere in the world. How are they choosing to approach it, and what can we learn as we look across the globe?
I'm sorry to interrupt, David, 1 second.
Yeah.
I just want to make sure the view the class is seeing shows the full slide, because I played with the view, and I'm seeing the screen in one half and your face in another half. Is the class seeing the whole screen? Because I cannot read much.
The whole deck, yeah. I'm only seeing the deck.
They're seeing mainly the deck, right? So, okay.
Yeah.
Okay, thank you, Anand.
So I'm sharing the whole screen, so you might have changed your own view, Sita, to something, but
okay,
hopefully everybody can see it.
Thank you, David.
Okay, so just in terms of things to bear in mind as we go through this, there are various elements that make up the regulatory framework. So there's the business side, the interests in it. There's also the actual regulations that the various legislatures put in place, what policies are put in place, but that's not necessarily how the public sees it. So it's important as we talk about regulation, it doesn't always follow that the regulations achieve what the regulators want or what the stakeholders want. So the public perception may well end up being different from the public policy. And that's important to keep in mind. So as we talk about how do we define safety, what about the ethical considerations behind the technology, what's the appropriate level to regulate at? Is it federal or local? Then as we move more into the policy areas, what do we want the policies to be around data privacy? What about urban planning? How do we bring the planning process into the bigger mobility process? And then what about policing? How does it, what we change from a regulatory point of view in terms of the law enforcement? How does that interact? So first off, we have to decide what the laws are, then we have to pass the laws, but then we have to police the laws. And that's something that comes in as being quite a difficult challenge. And how will the public feel about that? Now, as we go through this, hopefully you'll all feel that it isn't easy, because these are very complex questions, but they're challenging, and that makes them very interesting. And one of the things that I urge people, as you think through how do you go about shaping the new environment, is we need to be looking forward. And an awful lot of times legislators like to look backwards. Lawyers love precedent, but precedent isn't necessarily the best path forward for us. But that said, I will say that we have been through this before. In some ways, we've been through a paradigm shift in transportation and mobility technologies. Now, none of us can remember it because it's over 100 years ago, but when the first automobiles came out, and horseless carriages as they were called, nobody knew what to do. So there were no traffic signals, there were no rules of the road, people didn't know how to drive. And in fact, Carl Benz of Daimler-Benz said, back in 1886, that he didn't think the world would grow to have a very large car market because he didn't think people would be skilled enough to drive. Now, obviously, driving has become quite a bit easier. It's less mechanical than it was back in the day. But I think it's a useful reference point for us to think back and say, how did they introduce this brand new technology to a world that wasn't ready for it, a world that wasn't necessarily expecting it? And you had, as shown in that image there, this is from the UK, where they brought in a legislation that motor vehicles weren't allowed exceed 4 miles per hour, and they had to have a person walking in front of them waving a red flag to warn the public that this strange contraption was approaching. So it is something we've seen before, but it's not necessarily going to be the same experience again. And the second image then in this slide is one that went viral when a traffic cop in California pulled over one of the Google self-driving cars. This raises a huge amount of questions. So who's responsible for the car? Not necessarily the safety driver in the car isn't in control. You can't ticket a machine. And the cop ended up apparently walking away from this and had to go and seek more detail as to how law enforcement was going to interact with these new machines. But the reason apparently that this came about was that the vehicle was traveling very slowly because they were overemphasizing safety and arguably hindering traffic. So it's a strange world where we need to try and figure out, can the laws keep up with the technology, and who should be defining the rules? Should it be the self-driving car companies pushing their agenda versus the incumbents who don't necessarily want to see new entrants come into the market? And I think it's probably fair at this point to have a little bit of sympathy for the regulators. I mean, they're probably in a no-win situation. The media perception, the commercial perception of the technology as a new gold rush, and everybody's in a hurry, there's money to be made, versus the regulators who have to take the slow approach. They need to be quite conservative. They need to protect the public. And we need to figure out what happens when there's a conflict of pace between the federal government and state level. If you're talking about the US, I mean, in most jurisdictions, this is handled at a purely central government level, but it's quite a bit more complicated in the US with state approaches. And then you have the amplification of social media. So if there's an incident, so there was an incident where a self-driving car was recorded by a member of the public breaking a red light in San Francisco, that goes viral. And then suddenly the regulator is being called to act on this. So it's a very different modern environment that we're dealing with these things in. So it's quite an interesting challenge to say the poor regulators, if they act too slowly, they'll be accused of stifling innovation and potentially holding back US-based companies in particular and favoring their international competitors if the environment is overly regulated. But if they don't regulate and if they don't enforce standards, then they'll be accused of, playing fast and loose with public safety, which is not what a regulator wants. So in terms of what I mentioned with the tension between the federal level and the state level, as I said, you'll get a copy of the slides, so don't worry about reading into the detail of it. But just look at the picture here where you've got 29 states who have enacted legislation. And then you have 9 governors who have enacted executive orders. Then you have some states which have both, and you have states who have nothing. So you're ending up, and this is something that the people in the industry are terrified about, is this patchwork quilt of differing regulations where you can't operate a vehicle across the country the way you can a traditional automobile, which is the same across all the states. You can drive Route 66 from one side to the other, but in the self-driving car world, where autonomy, that you'll notice that testing is concentrated in particular states. And that's because some states have more agreeable laws and regulations than others where they're not allowed. So one of the things I love as a European looking at the US legislation approach is, I think the names that you give your bills are fantastic. I mean, in Europe, we tend to call things, it would be the Road Traffic Act of 2016 is the bill that regulates cars here. But you've got the House of Representatives called the Self-Drive Act, the Safely Ensuring Lives, Future Deployment and Research in Vehicle Evolution Act. It's brilliant how anybody can come up with making self-drive into an acronym is a real creative force. And the House of Representatives passed that but way back in 2017. However, the Senate equivalent, which was called not quite as creatively, but still pretty impressively known as AV Start, that bill didn't pass. So we didn't get the federal level agreement that we wanted to see to create a piece of legislation that's coherent kind of across the country. So the Department of Transport, while they're waiting and lobbying to try and get actual regulations passed, they have produced guidelines. I feel like these are statements of the policy, statement of intent, statement of direction of how they want the industry to evolve. So they published the third version of the guidelines from the Department of Transport in October 2018. And then subsequently, they've updated them again in January this year. So you can see, I mean, it's not often that you get a government department moving at that level, that pace, where they're replacing their own guidelines, you kind of, within 18 months. But that's how fast this space is moving as the regulators try and catch up with the progress in the industry to get those principles in place, even if they haven't managed to get the actual legislation in place. So if you're interested in kind of understanding the regulatory environment a little bit better, I would recommend downloading that PDF from the Department of Transport. The link is there. It's quite accessible. It's not written in legalese the way the bills are. So it's quite easy to read through and that. But let's shift across to the European Union now for a bit and see what are they doing. So they've taken a slightly different approach in that there's no powerhouse tech company in Europe driving the agenda the way there is in the US. You don't have the equivalent of a Waymo or Cruise or Zoox or Aurora or Voyage or any of those companies. The incumbents in Europe, particularly say the Japanese, the German manufacturers, BMW, Mercedes, they are developing technologies, but they're not pushing ahead towards the kind of level 5. They're much more in the level 2, 3 driver assistance phase rather than actually looking fully ahead towards autonomy. And I was at a conference in Brussels last year where the European Union were trying to get their story together, and they see self-driving cars purely as part of an overall future mobility strategy. So it includes an awful lot of emphasis on electrification. It includes an awful lot of climate control issues. And then their policies also cover things like inland waterways, drones, and even automation of light rail. So it's being looked at in Europe as part of a bigger piece, looking towards that future development of an overall EU mobility strategy. And just there's an interesting little note on the end of that slide there that ICE, or internal combustion engines, will be banned in the European Union by 2040 at the latest. And some countries are pulling that forward to 2030 as my home country plan in Ireland. Now, 2030 is really, really soon. That is not a long time in a public policy world. It's not a long time in an infrastructure world. And it's not a lot of time if you're a car manufacturer that works on 10-year cycles to consider that your entire business could be gone in 9 years. So you have, I guess, the moral here is that you've got competing priorities in Europe where the incumbents are struggling in this environment to say, how are we supposed to electrify and get to autonomy all in a parallel sort of time frame? But from a safety point of view, you've probably heard of GDPR and the privacy legislation in Europe, but there's an equivalent piece of safety legislation. So again, apologies that our European naming conventions are so dull. GDPR, General Data Protection Regulation, GSR, General Safety Regulation, nowhere near as clever as the naming in the US. But the interesting piece is the move towards safety in Europe is not waiting for autonomy. So they have specified that from 2022, which again is really, really close because, car manufacturers have signed off on their 2022 product plans already. Coming in Europe is something like intelligent speed assistance. So that's a feature that, just picking out one example, where European car manufacturers will have to equip their cars with technology where the car is aware of the speed limit of the road that it is on and will try to stick to the speed limit. So the car will only accelerate as much as it is allowed legally to that speed limit, and the driver has to intervene and has to explicitly enable the car to break the speed limit. So you can still speed if you wish, but your defense of saying, Your Honor, I didn't realize I was speeding is gone, because you have to override the car and say you want it to break the speed limit. So there's a huge emphasis in Europe that says, look, we're not going to wait for autonomous vehicles to be ready. We're not giving up on making the current paradigm safer. So that's an interesting piece for everybody to consider in terms of, if you're looking to maybe build a business case, you've got a startup for a piece of technology, safety related, then it may have quite a big market in this interim piece ahead of moving towards full autonomy. And just what it means with this change in regulation. So if you've got a Tesla in Europe, you don't have the same feature set that you have in the US. So you don't have summon and you don't have autopilot. They're not allowed in Europe. And one of the reasons why is that there's actually UN level, so even higher than EU, there's UN level regulations that apply in the EU. That means autopilot would have to be capable of completing a lane change within 5 seconds of signaling. Now, that typically doesn't happen because 5 seconds is a very short window to complete a lane change. And you have an example here of Tesla France lobbying to have the regulations changed because they don't suit autopilot. So this is just a quick little example of where you've got that tension between the regulatory environment and the technology. So it is a question of the lobbying that comes in where, you've got lobbying from trucking groups, you've got lobbying from car manufacturers, and it's all coming into the mix as the legislators try and figure out what's the correct approach to go forward. So,
David, Alexander, it's good we have Alexander from Volvo to be able to comment here today. Glad he was able to join. So he's basically saying, he's added a comment about how in Europe, the countries all want to be the leader in the space, but they're also, collaborating with the government to get the regulation moving, which is such a contrast to us here in US.
Yeah, I mean, I suppose one example of that on this slide then that I just pulled out to take an example, because obviously you don't want me to give everybody examples of all 27 EU countries, because, you know, we have better things to do than that. But just an example of our former friends who've left the EU in the UK, you know, they have their own projects, and their law commission are driving a public consultation to try and say, both to the public and the industry, what should we do? What is the appropriate way to legislate for these technologies? So again, if you're interested in just getting a sense of it, the Law Commission website in the UK has all of this publicly available. And I think, you know, again, it's nowhere near as good as the US naming conventions, but look at what they've decided to call this space in the UK. They're calling it HARPS, the Highly Automated Road Passenger Services space. So, you know, they probably would be better to stick to just coming up with the legislation than the names. There's a lot of detailed guidance available, again, for anyone who's interested in understanding the space. The UK has published 9 principles of their future of urban mobility strategy and where autonomy fits in that. So it's not a priority in the short term, because they're trying to prioritize the environmentally led initiatives, but it's in there as part of their mix for moving ahead and trying to reestablish, I guess, the British car industry outside of Europe and have that move forward. So it's all there. As I said, it's part of a focus that includes a lot of emphasis on the emissions piece. So the electrification having a lot of the priority talk, but automation is in there in the mix, rather than, I guess, in the US, you tend to feel that the focus is much more dramatically on autonomy than on the bigger mobility piece. Whereas in the EU and in the UK, I think you'll see a broader approach to the future of transportation. Just to pull another example in quickly in terms of what Germany have done, and Germany being, I guess, arguably the powerhouse of the European car manufacturing space. They've put some interesting principles out where there's an emphasis on almost veering into the ethics of it, to say that, you know, cars are not allowed make decisions based on the age or gender of the occupants. So that kind of sets us up to talk a little bit about ethics later on. But it's an interesting thing where I bet the people in the departments of transport who sat down and thought they were going to be regulating the future of cars probably weren't thinking that they were going to have to verse themselves in ethics. So I think it's another interesting piece I came across was that the Federal Highway Administration have actually been to Europe on a fact-finding mission to try and see, and I think this is a great example of cooperation, of not trying to reinvent the wheel yourself, but to learn what else is happening. And I think it's interesting to see the Highway Administration going to Europe and visiting European cities and looking at and then publishing a report. As you see there, it is available for download from the Department of Transport, to be able to say, you know, what have we learned? What do we like about the European approach? Then if we go slightly further afield to another great innovator in this space, to Singapore. So Singapore's Land Transport Authority is the regulatory agency there. And they've set 2022 as the deadline or their target for deploying autonomous transport in a couple of districts. I mean, if you've ever been to Singapore, Singapore as a city is broken up into quite distinct districts, and each district then can operate, is a great test bed for putting little schemes or pilots, proof of concepts in place. But the level of detail that Singapore have gone into, I mean, their request for information for companies looking to participate in trials there is 122 pages long. I don't recommend you read it, but just to give you an example of how much regulatory effort is being put into this, that, 34 pages alone, so, pretty much a quarter of the document is dealing with 5G and looking at the V2X, the vehicle to infrastructure, communications potential. And again, they're looking to try and pull in drones and other types of autonomy into it. So regulating for the big piece, the whole ecosystem that we've talked about, rather than doing it on a more limited basis. But if you look across the world, there are a lot of different approaches. So you can see on the map there, just some highlighted, where every country is trying to figure out what should they do, when should they do it, and what are the guidelines that need to happen. KPMG have published quite useful, it's obviously things date very quickly in this space, but it does come from 2019, so relatively recent. And KPMG have published this report that rates 25 countries across a number of different criteria. So it's quite a good place for you to start if you want to just get a high level view across the globe of what's going on and who's doing what. But I'll just pause for a second there before I go on and talk about privacy and ethics. Did anybody have any comments or questions they wanted to raise at this stage? Oh, okay. So I'll keep.
China. What about China?
What about China? So yeah, China is an interesting one. I think, the Chinese approach, because of regulation, is regulation there is very strict, and there doesn't tend to be much pushback on it, and they're extremely keen. So the government is playing a really, really active role in trying to push the domestic industry forward. So there's a lot of trials going on. There's robotaxi trials in most major cities. And they've even done examples whereby when building new highways, the Chinese government has mandated that 2 lanes of the highway are cordoned off and kept separate for use by autonomous vehicles. So giving them that kind of slight difference between the public road and the AV space, but giving the cars room to develop, room to evolve. And I think from a public perception point of view, it's a very interesting approach. So the public are going to see the autonomous vehicles speeding past in their own dedicated lanes. And that's going to, hopefully, I would imagine, familiarize people with the technology, get them used to seeing cars driving themselves. And that's probably going to influence the public perception quite a bit. But I think certainly the Chinese space, I know there's a book coming out later in the year called A Race to AV between the US and China, identifying those two as the powerhouses, and seeing, Russia and Europe being left behind on the cutting edge of it. So yeah, China is definitely a space to watch, but it's not as easy to watch as the trials in the US tend to be. So I'll just move on now and kind of look at some of the other areas around regulation that are quite interesting around privacy and ethics. So again, this is the last example I think I'll use, but again, fantastic piece of legislative naming, the Spy Car Act, the Security and Privacy in Your Car Act. So this was a piece of legislation to look at saying, we need to control what happens with the data that's generated, as we've talked about in the technology session last week. An autonomous vehicle is a moving sensor bed that is just sucking up and creating data at an incredible rate. So what happens to that data? And I know it's Sudha's favorite topic, who owns that data? Is it going to stay in the car? Is it valuable? What about the privacy side? Where is it stored, collected, transmitted? So there's a huge piece of privacy work to be considered. And at the moment, there's a little bit of lack of clarity. Is this something that the Highway Transportation Agency should be dealing with? Not necessarily. Privacy of data is not necessarily a transport core skill. And it's the FTC, the Trade Commission, who would normally look after matters of consumer privacy. So the two of them are working together to try and figure out what is the approach. But I think one other interesting piece, so this photo here of the Waymo and the patrolman was part of a training exercise that Waymo did with emergency services to try and help train the car to recognize emergency vehicles and how to respond. But one of the interesting pieces is how much public to police interaction happens on the basis of a traffic stop. Now, if we assume they all drive perfectly legally, so there will be no traffic stops, there'll be no red light violations, there'll be no speeding violations, then the interactions between police and members of the public will fall. And from a crime prevention point of view, often a lot of police interventions happen under the pretext of a traffic stop. And then, of course, there's the revenue side. So we will come back and talk about revenue again. But those fines that you get for speeding, fines that you get for running a stop sign, that's a hugely important source of revenue that will probably disappear. So I think, just from an ethical point of view, so this part, just to preface it by saying, if you're talking about ethics and self-driving cars, do not simplify it down to the trolley problem. That is what people tend to do when they're not willing to actually investigate and discuss this as a complex issue. But what I think, anyone who's not familiar with the trolley problem, it's kind of a philosophy 101 piece of figuring out, what is the ethical thing to do if a trolley is speeding towards a group of helpless people and you can intervene and have it kill only one person instead of multiple persons should you intervene. So that's kind of the basic of the trolley problem. And it's often used as a shorthand for self-driving cars. So if a self-driving car is facing a no-win situation, it's going to crash, it can't avoid the crash. Should it somehow prioritize the occupants? Should it prioritize crashing into a bad person as opposed to a good person, whatever those labels mean? And I think we could spend an awful lot of time talking about ethics. What I would recommend you do is MIT have a website with what they call the moral machine. So an experiment to look very particularly at the ethical questions that come up around self-driving cars. And I think, this is definitely not one where there's a correct answer, but it's one that comes up quite a lot, particularly who are opposed to self-driving cars, to say, look, we can't hand ethical life and death decisions to a machine. But I think the counterpoint to that is, we don't know that a human driver who's faced with a split-second decision, they're not necessarily always going to make the correct ethical decision either. So my recommendation is go to the moral machine, have a look, just let it challenge you to think about the different scenarios and how might we reach a consensus. So I said, there's no right or wrong answer. but I think there's possibly a consensus view as to how best to move beyond this overly simplistic trolley problem that tends to come up when there are kind of lazy journalism views of what's happening in the space. So, part of the reason that I say there's no easy answer is that, from an ethics point of view and data privacy, we're not necessarily all that clear ourselves on what we want. So, most people would instinctively say they want their medical records to be kept private. But, at the same time, you probably want to share it with your medical practitioners. So the definition of privacy is a bit of a moving feast. And as commuters, we probably want privacy as to our location and our movements, but we probably do want our movement data to feed into an algorithm that promises to reduce congestion. So when we think about the ethics around our data and privacy, that's another big area for debate and discussion. And also then, do we get to the point of consent? What if you can't get into a robo-taxi in 10 years time without agreeing to their terms of service? But what happens to your data? So location data does reveal an awful lot about a person. So you might think, oh, it doesn't really matter that the mobility company knows where I was, but they can infer quite a lot about you as a person from your movements. So as you consider your own role, your own careers in autonomy, just think about how to do it ethically. What are those data questions that we need to do? And I came across this term called ossification, which is a computer science term for the tendency that if you take something and make it an algorithm, it can codify the current state of the world. So it can take an existing practice and kind of cement it because you've made it automated rather than a manual process. So it's something to avoid, is this tendency that we can take an existing status quo, and when we're applying technology to it, we can actually make things worse and harder to change rather than easier. And I love this example of some of the early questions that we're going to get about regulating self-driving technology. So even before we're there, so you have Tesla as an example, have meticulously integrated cameras into the car. If you've ever kind of looked at a Tesla up close, you need to go looking for it. It's not like the Waymo behind me where you can see every sensor on it. It's not very well integrated at all. But if you look at a Tesla, their sensors are perfectly integrated. So you need to know what you're looking for to spot the cameras that are in the door pillars. You might even think they were hidden rather than integrated, but they're required for Tesla's Summon and Autopilot type features. But what happens, so if you do a quick search on YouTube and look for Tesla Sentry mode, you can see examples where the Tesla cameras recorded a lady unplugging another Tesla so that she could have the charger for her own car. So the cars are surveillance vehicles. They're recording what happens in and around them. And you may say, it wasn't very nice of her to take the charger out of one Tesla and use it for herself, but did she have a reasonable expectation of privacy that shouldn't be recorded? So, even before we get to self-driving, you will see these examples of ethical data, privacy, regulatory things. Is that footage admissible in court if you choose? So in the example of the YouTube video where the car was damaged, is that admissible? So there's a lot going on. You've got the data protection commissioners getting involved. So this is just a quick extract from the EU data protection commissioner piece around dash cams. So, not even something that we would consider part of self-driving level technology, but these are new pieces of technology that are changing the automotive, the transportation landscape, and raising these questions that we need to figure out. And ultimately, the success of these advances will rely as much on the public perception. Do the public trust these cars? Do the public think that these cars are their friend? Do they think they're spying on them? And you're going to have a range of perceptions and that in between these things. And it's very hard for people to figure out what they think. And I'm always extremely skeptical of surveys. So, every few weeks, you'll probably see, if you follow the autonomous vehicle media, you'll see surveys saying public opposed to self-driving cars, or 50% of the public would be scared to get in one. I discount all of those surveys because I don't think there's any point in asking people about technology they're not familiar with and whether they may or may not like it. And it usually boils down to who funded the study. So if you just take the example that I have on the slide there of what's essentially can lead to the same headline in a piece of market research, where if you say to someone, do you think driverless cars reducing deaths by 90% is a good thing? It's going to be difficult to get people not to answer yes to that question. But if you ask people, would you be afraid to get in a driverless car that might be programmed to kill you? Guess what? You're going to end up with a fairly sensational headline that the public are completely opposed to self-driving. So always just think as you look at the public perception question, who's funding the survey? What were the questions asked? Is it actually adding to move the space forward? Is it a progressive survey or not? And I think, Bill Ford, the great grandson of Henry Ford, kind of sums it up quite well when he says, look, we might get the technology pieces of this fixed before we have the society pieces. Because I just want to finish up kind of now by pulling us down from the high level regulatory stuff, the legislation, and just look at the impact from an urban mobility point of view. So at a city level, how might these regulatory changes, these technological changes impact them? So across the globe, you'll see differing priorities in different cities. So some will prioritize the interaction with transit. Some will look at the urban planning and things like urban sprawl. Others will be very worried about the jobs impact. So, is this going to take away jobs from truckers, from chauffeurs? What about the tax point of view? So we'll come on and talk about some of the revenue hits for cities, but is there something where you would have, sorry, I probably shouldn't have thrown in all of these acronyms here without explaining myself, but VMT, so vehicle miles traveled. So how many vehicle miles traveled? And is this something that you want to tax these cars that are traveling around your city? Because you may have ZOV and SOV, so zero occupancy vehicles and single occupancy vehicles. So single occupancy vehicles are not very efficient, but zero occupancy vehicles where the self-driving car is going around empty so that it doesn't have to park. So it's actually creating congestion because they don't want to have to pay for parking. Is that something that you want to tax? And what about your curb rules? Are you going to allow self-driving cars just pull up anywhere they like and block the street curbs? So there's an awful lot of city level questions that, you can talk about regulation at the high level of, are these cars safe? Do we want them on our streets? But then when you come down to the actual street level, what are we going to do? Are we going to allow them just stop and start where they like? Are we going to tax them? There's a lot of questions there. So again, in terms of a global perspective on this, the Bloomberg Philanthropies and the Aspen Institute have a very good website that tracks what's happening, what the policies are in different cities. So if the city level stuff is something you're interested in, have a visit to that website and have a look around. And you'll see the change over time as more and more cities do it. But cities are in general, I would say they're afraid of self-driving cars. So is it a question of, are they going to lose parking revenues? They're being lobbied on all sides. it's very difficult for a city to do the right thing, because most infrastructure decisions they've made, infrastructure, concrete has a 30 to 50 year life. If you build a highway, it's going to be there for 30 to 50 years. So it's exceptionally difficult to get the timing right of how you change your infrastructure. What's going to happen to your zoning, your planning laws, if self-driving cars change how people commute? And then, there are other things then that always fascinate me when you get into this space and talk about what else could happen. So what are known as second and third order impacts. And the best example of this is around transplants. So at the moment, the number one source of transplant organs in the US is car crashes. So if we end car crashes, then all of a sudden the healthcare system doesn't have the supply of organs that it currently gets from car crashes. So what happens? The people who are on the waiting list for organs, they're going to die probably, unless we can come up with another solution. So is this that, bioengineering will enable us to grow organs, or terrific solutions like that? But, from a city point of view, you have to consider, what about your healthcare budget? Is self-driving cars a good thing or a bad thing for your healthcare? So cities are very complex, interconnected systems that can't just look at transport on its own and say, how is that going to happen? And as I've said, from a revenue point of view, cities are generally very, very dependent on the income from car-related activities. So you can see there, 25 largest cities generated $5 billion from vehicle-related revenues. So if a significant portion of that goes away, you will have cities short on budgets, and city budgets pay for things like schools. So you have this strange correlation that by automating driving, we could end up with less money for kids going to school. So it's a very complex and interesting piece for cities to figure out, how are they going to do this? And that's why I think if you're in an AV company and you're meeting with city authorities and city planners and regulators, and you sense hesitancy, it may not be, that they're Luddites who are opposed to progress or technology, but they're grappling with very real budgetary challenges that the technology that we're promoting maybe brings. So I'll just finish up with a couple of examples that I like from the parking space. So, parking is not a new problem. If you thought I was diving into history, talking about 100 years ago and men walking in front of automobiles with red flags, and going all the way back now to 700 BC and the Assyrian king. And I love his approach to parking. So if you parked your chariot on his road, he cut your head off. So, the next time you get a parking fine, don't feel too bad. You've done better than if you lived in the time of King Sennacherib, because you probably don't want to get your head cut off just because you parked in a zone you shouldn't have. And then kind of coming all the way back to the present, and you've got the Apple headquarters. So lovely shiny building in Cupertino, but how many people know that even though it's a gigantic and very impressive office, the car park is bigger than the office space? I mean, that seems absolutely crazy in a modern world, but that's the kind of pace that infrastructure moves at. So, Apple were required under their local zoning laws, whether they wanted to or not, in order to get permission to build that much office space, the laws required that they built 11,000 parking spaces as well. So, the regulation can determine what happens. You can go in with the best of intention, but unless you're aware of the regulatory environment, the framework that we're operating in, you're going to come up with these kind of shocks and surprises. So That's it in terms of time. We're just like 2 or 3 minutes to finish up. If there's any questions that anybody has, as I said, you've got a copy of the slides. Just bear in mind, you know, you need to be aware of regulation. You need to know about policy. You need to know about perceptions. And there's some very interesting things that are guiding and shaping and challenging the evolution of AVs. So I'll leave it there. And if anybody wants to jump in with any questions in the last few minutes.
Tomorrow's speaker is going to be speaking about non-market strategy, which includes regulation. So, and Virend is going to interview the speaker. Virend, do you want to tell us anything about it? What to expect?
Surely. Hello, everyone. David, great presentation. Really impressive. Kind of revenue streams by different cities. That's shocking. $5 billion, 17 million per day, and transplanting organs. Nice. I really enjoyed it. Thank you. Talking about tomorrow, we will be interviewing Kevin Schlosser, who is the founder of DC AVA, Automotive Vehicle Association. And he will present some interesting facts about how he got into it, why he got into it, and also, you know, what are the factors that are not non-market factors that will affect the future adoption of AVs. And David, you have touched upon a few of the things which can be the guiding force, and he will talk about the reality on the ground, what is happening, why it is happening, and what we can expect. So it'll be an exciting session. I would request everybody to join, and looking forward to it. Thank you, Sudha, for the opportunity.
Thank you, Virend. Okay. So, David, this is good. If you see, we were taking notes, and this was actually, I think, one of the most engaging regulation topics because people were chatting. And even before you said about the shocking transplant part, people were pretty engaged. Thank you.